I'm working on quilting an antique quilt top, and this one was made in the late 1800s. I want to say 70 or 80. The fabrics are all in really good shape, so I didn't need to do a lot of repair work on it. The problem with this quilt top was that at some point in its history, somebody decided it would be a good idea to wash it. And while it didn't harm the fabric by making any holes in it, it did create a whole lot of strings on the back, you know, as the fabric starts to unravel. Fortunately, the seam allowances were big enough that it didn't come apart. But what it did do is create a lot of distortion. A lot of these blocks are you know, all the pieces have a lot of bias in it that tends to stretch them out of shape. And of course it was all hand pieced, so it wasn't perfect to begin with. You know, I don't know if you can see how much this point, for example, got removed when they pieced it together. So it wasn't perfectly made, as most antique quilt tops are not, and it had been washed, so it's distorted. The end result being that it's very, very difficult to make it flat. So I'm doing my best to work around that, rather than trying to take the whole thing apart and rebuild the entire top to make it perfectly flat, the way you would a new quilt. I'm working around that. So the first thing that I did is did the layering of the backing and the batting and the quilt top, and I did initially used spray baste to lightly hold those three layers together, and then and so that only needed to hold them together enough that I could get it over to the machine, and I used a walking foot and stitched between the individual blocks. That gave me essentially basting on all four sides. You know, it's not really basting, it's actual quilting that'll stay in. But now it shows the extra fullness in the blocks. And I needed to do that so that I could keep the extra fullness in each block contained. If I didn't have the stitching all around it, what I would end up doing is trying to push that away and do the quilting and then push it to the next spot, and I would end up with a much bigger pucker somewhere further on down. So by stitching around each block, I've sort of contained the amount of extra fullness that's within each block, and I can work around that. In these baskets I have you know, some portions of the block that have extra puffiness and some that don't, and but it'll all work out in the end, and it is an antique. It's gonna look less than perfect, but still very pretty, I think. So I used a brown printed fabric floral print for the backing. This is not a reproduction or a vintage fabric, but the color works, and that was the important thing to me. I'm using kind of a cheddar colored thread that matches the cheddar fabric. This may or may not show up on the camera as the accurate color, but this is what I would call sort of a butterscotch color, the main the setting blocks, and the yellowy orange thread works well with those as well. So when I started to quilt this, I started on one end and worked towards the center. This row that I'm on right now is the center of the quilt. So as soon as I finish this row of the butterscotch colored blocks, I will turn the quilt around and quilt it from the outside edge back in again. What I do to fit the quilt in is, as I quilt the edge, and then I kind of roll it up a little bit so I can work to the next block, and then I roll it up a little bit more so I can work to the next one, and that's how you can fit a full-size quilt into your domestic sewing machine. And this is a treadle machine, and these old machines do have quite a bit of space under the arm here. It's almost, it's a little over 8 inches, I think. So it's pretty good size for a basic domestic machine, and it's a straight stitch machine. That's all it does. It doesn't, the feed dogs don't drop. It doesn't do reverse. It's just straight stitch, and that's really all you need for quilting. So the foot I'm going to use is a basic, readily available free motion quilting foot. This one happens to be the open toe kind, and very inexpensive. I think this was $7, and I bought it online. You know, Amazon, eBay, lots of places would have these. And what I did is I bent this arm. This arm is what goes over the needle clamp and makes the foot go up and down as the needle goes up and down. And by bending it up like that, I have reduced the amount of hop that the foot has. So if I put this on, let me just show you, when the needle goes up, it should make it hop, but it doesn't. So I'm not going to get much jumping on the foot, and I like that. The constant hopping up and down tends to make me dizzy. But in order to make it work, because the feed dogs aren't down and it's not going to hop very much, I really reduced the tension on the top by unscrewing this pretty far up. That's much farther than you would on a normal for normal stitching. But I don't know if you can see this, but by reducing that, there's quite a good bit of play in the presser bar because this is so loose. So that's what's going to make the quilt move easily. I'm doing all the quilting by eye pretty much. The only thing I'm marking, and I'm using a white chalk type marking pencil, and my template for this is a thread spool. I just kind of eyeball the center here and mark a circle, and that will be my template for the quilting, and that's really all I need. I use my seam ripper as a stiletto type, you know, if I need to get my fingers under there and kind of work a pucker out before I stitch over it. That's what I use, because my fingers are too fat to get under there. So pick a spot to start on that circle that I drew, draw up your thread, and I'm stuck. That thread was stuck on the bottom somewhere. You want to get your starting point lined up, and then well, here's the problem. I just realized I'm not in the center here, so I'm going to start over. If I look at that, it's much further that way than that way. What I should do is draw an X to mark the center better, but anyway. Not to worry. If it's not perfect, as I said, we're not going to be able to make it perfect because we're starting with an imperfect product. What we want to do is make it pretty. Okay, so I've got my my thread ready to go, and I will go around the circle, and let me bring this in a little bit so that you can see better. Now the hanging off thread I will address when I'm done here. I don't want to cut it off because it can come undone. So I'll show you how I deal with that in a minute. I'll do the little parts of the feather in the center, and then I'll do the outside after that. So, oops, put my foot down. So we need to do what you need to be aware of when you're working on this is how fast you're moving your hands and how fast you're moving your machine. There's a kind of a combination of machine speed and hand speed that you need to be aware of so that your stitches turn out nice. And if you go too fast with your hands and not fast enough with your machine, you end up with some sort of weird looking stitches, particularly on the back. And ideally, the back should look as nice as the front. So now that I've got that middle circle, I'm going to sort of do some adjusting. So I've got a relatively flat block that I can work around. I'm going to pull this out of the way and go up to that corner because I want to fill in as much of that block as I can. So I'm going to quilt that first part of the feather right up into the corner, and then start to work now. Do you see all this extra here in the corner? My goal is going to be to try to not create a pucker in that. So as I come around, I'm going to pay some extra attention here to sort of spread that fabric. and then again in here, so that it doesn't create a big lump. The other thing that's going to make it smooth out some is once it's done, I'm going to wash it again. Now, I said it wasn't a good idea to wash a unquilted quilt top, but it, I think, is a good idea to wash them when they're finished. On these old antiques, I almost always use cotton batting, and the cotton will shrink when it is washed, and that will cause a little that kind of puckery look that you see on an antique quilt. And from the batting shrinking, and that will help to hide a lot of the irregular puckering in the fabric that may look very obvious in the quilt as you're working on it, but it'll become less obvious after it's washed. So, as much as you can, you want to try to avoid stitching in a pucker, and then after it's done, we'll put it in the wash, and we'll get some natural puckering to happen from the natural shrinkage of the batting, and that helps to hide a lot of the imperfections, and it makes the quilt feel more authentic, I think, because authentic antiques, when they're washed, really do take on a sort of a crinkly finish that you don't get with a new quilt if you don't use cotton batting. So the other thing with these old antique quilts that I like to do is I like to try to not do a quilt design that feels too modern. You know, I used to think that the only thing you should ever do to an antique top is to quilt it by hand, because that would make it feel more authentic. But my arthritis in my fingers and thumb joints have made me realize that maybe it's okay to do them by machine, and they turn out nice. The thing is, like I said, I try to keep a fairly traditional quilt design going on. So there's the quilting in that block. Now, what I would do to get the thread out here is you want to lift your foot, pull back some, get your thread cut off, go back to where you started, put your needle right back in there, turn it down and pull it up. Then you have your bottom thread come up to the top. You want to cut that off, and so now I have these two. This is where I started and stopped, and I want to hide those. What you can do is, and it's acceptable. Just and what I'm doing here is just tying a knot in the both pieces just for extra strength. That's not necessary, but anyway. So what you can do is just do a couple of back tacks back and forth over the starting point, and that's fine. They will most likely hold well, and you don't really have to worry about starting and stopping. But what I like to do is, and I do this, a lot of people will wait until the end, and you'll have a million threads all over your quilt, and then they'll go back and bury them. I like to do it block at a time, and they sell self-threading needles that are easier to use than the one I've got here, and I just couldn't find one, so I just thread the threads and poke it in between the layers, not to the back. So you want to be sure that you're not through the back. You just want it to go between the layers and into the batting, and it's going to go up, and then you'll cut it off, and then we'll do the same on this one. And I'm doing both ends at once with a needle with a big enough eye to make that happen. You can do one at a time if you can't thread both pieces at once. See, I missed one. I only got one of them in there. So there's how I bury the thread tails, and I'll move to the next block, adjust the fabric again, get everything situated, and wad it up under the machine exactly right so that you can still see what you're doing, and do the same thing and work your way down. And then again, after I'm done with this row, I'll turn it around and do the other side. And here you can sort of see what I've been doing with the basket blocks. They're not getting heavily quilted. I'm just doing outlines around the pieces. Couldn't think of a decent, of a unobtrusive design to put into the white fabric, but the pieces are small enough that I don't think I need anything. What I'm going to do is finish the quilting the way I've got it, put it in the wash, and see how it comes out. If these end up being very puffy, I may go back and do some sort of a tacking down type quilting in those areas, but I don't think I'll need it. So anyway, that's how I approach doing quilting on a full-sized quilt, working in rows, rolling it up from the edge to the middle as I go, and then switching, and so that really you only ever have to have half of the quilt width in here at a time. So I work, if the quilt is as this one is about 70 inches wide, so to get to the center I've got about 45 inches of quilt rolled up in here, and I've used a pretty thin batting, so this one rolls up really nice. Sometimes I'll have a much thicker batting and I'll have a much bigger wad of quilt built up in here, but it fits and it can be done. So you can do some pretty nice quilting on a pretty basic machine, and happy quilting.